All right, over to you, Lisa. Thank you so much.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Lisa Shirk. I am at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and I also co-chair this working group, Community of Practice, with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, focused on how peace builders use technology to support conflict transformation. So we host monthly webinars like this one as spaces for technologists and peace builders to meet together. In 2022, we hosted one of our guests today, Andrew Konya from Remesh, to explain how Remesh works and how the UN had used Remesh in the peace processes in Libya and Yemen. Andrew then this summer was part of a 4-day advanced workshop here at the University of Notre Dame on using deliberative technology in highly polarized contexts. And Wasim al-Masri, another one of our speakers today, joined us also from Palestine to share his experience working with this. So in June, we brought nearly 50 peace builders together to learn how to use Remesh and other platforms because we are trying to advance the concept here of strategic peace building and how we might be able to amplify our work, both building movements and advancing dialogue through technology. Strategic peace building really includes commitments to both protest and build power through nonviolent social movements, as well as advancing dialogue and relationship building. In my research, I call this the two-handed approach to peace building. One hand is up to protest the violence, the mass atrocity, and the genocide, and one hand is out to build relationships and to build trust, particularly across the lines of conflict. We think it's really important to listen to a wide range of views so that we really understand all the different points of view there are in any context. And that's where we find the cracks in the door that might usher in a ceasefire, an end to the occupation, and a movement toward a just peace, in this case for Palestinians and Israelis. We know from research that war ends in two ways. Between 10 and 20% of wars end through military victory, and the other 80 to 90% of wars end through negotiation, which begins with people-to-people dialogue. There are few spaces where Palestinians can talk with other Palestinians to listen and understand their own community. And part of what we'll hear about today is how Remesh was used for that. And the same is also true for Israelis having conversation and dialogue with many other Israelis. We believe that deliberative technology, at which Remesh is a form of this type of technology, we believe that it enables democratic participation even in the midst of mass atrocities and war. Today, we have three people joining us to describe the use of this deliberative technology, Remesh.ai, in Palestine and Israel. We will begin with Wasim al-Masri, Director of Programs at the Alliance for Middle East Peace. We'll then turn it over to Natali Levin-Schwartz. We'll then turn it over to Andrew Konya, who's the CEO of Remesh.ai. And then we'll close with Natali Levin-Schwartz, who's the Director of Impact and Policy Research at the Alliance for Middle East Peace. So Wasim, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Andrew, for bringing the presentation up. Hi, everyone. My name is Wasim al-Masri. As Lisa said, I'm the Director of Programs at the Alliance for Middle East Peace, or ALMEP for short. I'm also a father, an activist, and a third-generation refugee from Gaza who currently live in the West Bank. And I wanted to take some time first to speak a little bit about what ALMEP is. We are a coalition of over 160 organizations across Israel and Palestine dedicated to support civil society and people-to-people peace building. We're the largest network of its kind in the region, so we're both in with both local and international allies to lay a groundwork for sustainable peace. And our mission has been to support peace builders and promote civil society grassroots initiative. And through that, we're focusing also on top-down approaches to strengthen political support for peace building by advocating for policy changes that support Israeli and Palestinian peace building civil society. Now, one of the biggest achievements that ALMEP was able to accomplish in the last 7 years, in 2020, our role was instrumental in passing the U.S. Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, which secured $250 million over 5 years for peace building in the region. And this acts today support many of our member organizations in their work on the ground. And since 2006, we've grown our network and we continue to advocate globally to sustain this vital work with a call to create an international fund for peace. We are currently focusing, as you might imagine, on addressing the trauma experienced by peace builders and communities through our trauma programs on the ground, in addition to supporting voices of women in peace building and the ongoing work with our member clusters regarding producing policy recommendation for decision makers. You obviously could read more about this in our website. I left it here, so it's www.allmen.org. And now we could talk a little bit about the project. Andrew, if you could, thank you. So a little background. Initially, the vision for AI Pulse, the project proposed by Andrew, was ambitious: to use AI-driven collective dialogue to find common ground across Israeli and Palestinian communities. The idea was that we could identify shared concerns and values that both populations care about and deliver these insights to peace builders who could advocate for them to policymakers. And the goal was to help those in power understand and respond to the voices of the people most impacted by the conflict. However, as you can imagine, the work continues, and we dug into the project, and the reality was stark. The peace builders themselves, our intended messengers, were facing significant challenges. They needed space to regroup, reorient, reconnect with their own foundational issues, right? And before they could advocate extremely, even externally, for a broader societal perspective, this insight led to a shift in our approach to this project. We recognized that before engaging the public, peace builders from diverse backgrounds, and we're talking about three primary groups here: Jewish Israelis, Palestinians from the occupied territories, and Palestinian citizens of Israel, they needed a safe, structured environment to have this difficult but necessary conversations with each other. And with the help of Remesh and the technology, we created a space where peace builders could connect with honesty and empathy away from public scrutiny. This was a critical first step, building a foundation of shared values and goals that we could then build upon as we broaden the dialogue to the wider public. And I think here I can stop and give Andrew the opportunity to elaborate more on the plans.
Awesome. Thank you, Wasim. Yeah, so I'll note, as the technologist here, I'm going to walk you through the technical how. The what, I think, is sort of what Wasim teed up here. We ended up focusing not away from the residents because it wasn't ready yet, and on how can we create a space to help peace builders on all sides find common ground that they can build on to support dialogue going forward. And so what I'm about to walk you through is kind of a technical deep dive into the methodology that we used over the course of maybe 3 or 4 months to hopefully arrive at some common ground and understanding and a space where dialogue can continue, so that with the hopes that we can now move from not just the peace builders, but to the resident populations. So I'm now going to walk you through kind of a academic style, building from the ground up. So we're going to start with what's a collective dialogue. Some of you may know, you can tune out, but I'll show those of you who don't. Then how do we use a collective dialogue to actually find common ground? And then how do we turn the common ground finding into a recursive deliberative process, something that we're not just going to run once, but that we can run iteratively over and over, so that things can actually progress over time instead of hoping for a one-shot solution. So I'll start with collective dialogues. So you can think of a collective dialogue as you would an individual dialogue, except in this case between a person and a population of people, a group of people. Note, in this case, we are not talking about the full Israeli or Palestinian populations. We're just talking about this group of peace builders. Now, the dynamics of a collective dialogue are basically a back and forth where the participants can do a few things. So there's going to be a moderator. That moderator can ask poll questions, they can send information through messages, and they can trigger a collective response process. And this collective response process is something where participants are going to respond to a prompt in their own words, vote on the prompts of others, and then we're going to distill all of those results down, and that's going to kind of be the key output of this step. So let me show you how this works. So if you're a participant coming in, the first thing we're going to do is ask for some demographics. And so in this case, it might be, where do you reside, Israel or Palestine? Where do you associate with? What's your general age or gender? Things like this. Then as the dialogue goes on, you might see some things that you're going to learn, and then there's going to be some prompt. That prompt is going to be written by a person or by the moderators. I'll talk a little bit about how we get there in a bit. It's natural language, and all participants are now going to respond in their own words. So they're going to type in their response to that prompt. Then once they click send, they're going to see the prompts that are typed in by other participants. And so they are going to vote on those. They're going to say, I agree or disagree with this, or we're going to have them choose between pairs of responses. And note that each participant is going to vote maybe around 10 to 20 times for each one of these prompts that everyone is responding to. Now, at this point, what we have is a sparse sampling of everybody's votes. So about 10 to 20 votes per person, but I think on average, we might have 100 people in a conversation. And so we use something called elicitation inference to predict all of the missing votes. It's not perfect. It's maybe 75 to 80% accurate. And if that makes you a little uneasy, that is healthy and that is good. And you'll see how in the process, we take the assumption that maybe that's wrong and build a process that's robust to it anyway. But once we have this prediction of every participant's likely agreement with every single response typed by another participant, this lets us combine it with the demographic data and get an estimate of what fraction of these different segments of the population are likely to agree with each of the different statements that were submitted by one of the participants. So we have all of participants' statements and all of the likely agreements across all of the segments. So this is going to be the key data we're going to work with, and we'll come back to this. But the other thing that we can do with this is we can show a participant the amount of agreement that their particular response to the prompt had. And we can show them a sampling of the responses that were most representative and how well those represent the groups overall. And that is one collective response cycle. Type your response, make some votes, see the results around your response and others, and continue. And over the course of a dialogue, this is going to go back and forth, maybe 10 to 15 different times. So for 10 to 15 different prompts. So that is the collective dialogue part. In a sense, it's sort of simple. It's designing these prompts ahead of time, having people respond in their own words, vote, aggregate the results, and that's what we have. And so this kind of cartoon version is what we'll use going forward, where the output of a collective dialogue is going to be the participant statements, the things that they wrote, and the vote data that we have on those particular statements. So now how do we use that to actually find common ground? So obviously we start with the collective dialogue, but we can't end there. So we start with all of our data that comes out of the collective dialogue. So again, all of the statements written by participants with the voting data. Then what we need to do is we need to identify of all of those statements, what are the ones that are most likely to represent common ground? And to do this, we use two different algorithms. The first one is referred to as deliberate bridging. In this case, we want to find the statements that have the highest agreement across all the groups that we specify ahead of time. So we might say, find the statements that have the highest agreement across Israelis and Palestinians, or across the religious and non-religious, or across males and females. And so this comes from us knowing ahead of time where we think these lines of division lie. And this gives us an initial set of statements that are likely to have high agreement across those groups. The second algorithm we use is a continuous bridging algorithm. It is actually the same algorithm that's used in X community notes. If you've ever used the X, formerly known as Twitter platform, and seen a community notes, the way that algorithm works is it finds statements that have high agreement among people who typically disagree. And so it doesn't ahead of time assume that any particular identity is associated with disagreement. It instead learns what the underlying patterns of disagreement are, and then among the people who tend to disagree, finds the things that they agree on. So this is called continuous bridging. And so what we did here is we combine both of these together. We get the likely to be bridging responses from the deliberate bridging approach. We combine those together with the likely to be bridging responses from the continuous bridging approach. This gives us all of our air quotes bridging statements. And that really, I should say, we think they are bridging statements, but we don't know for sure yet. But if you imagine these statements, not all of them are worded particularly greatly. There's typos and things are imperfect, and there's a good degree of redundancy. As you can imagine, the things that people all agree on might show up more than one time. And so in the next step, what we need to do is distill kind of these versions of the statements down to their best versions. We want the best versions to be unique, so we don't want to state any ideas twice. We want them to be articulate, so they're well formed, but we want them to be in the language that the original responses are in, because we want to stay true to simply acting as a mirror to reflect back what participants said during the dialogue. And so the approach that we use to do this, to distill these bridging statements, is to use an LLM, a large language model. The kind of technical approach here is you can think of it as a two-step process. In the first step, we extract what are the unique ideas. There might be 20 statements, but in those 20 statements, there might only be 7 unique ideas that are in there. Then we're going to combine those unique ideas with the examples of what we mean by articulate and the language from the participants themselves, so that we can generate distilled versions of those statements that are still in the language of participants, that are true to the core ideas that were unique in there and that are well articulated. And this gives us what we would call our distilled statements. Now, at this step, we could just go on and say, we're likely have succeeded and call it here. But as you noted, there is potential errors. There's a chance that our predictive model might have gone awry. And so maybe one of these isn't actually consensus. And there's a chance that the LLM may have done something funky along the way. And so we do two things. The first is that we add an expert step in here. And experts in this case mean some of the folks literally on this call, reviewing these manually to make sure that the outputs of the LLM were true to the original statements that came into them. And then the last bit is that we're actually going to then go back to participants to do a good old-fashioned vote on these statements. I'll note there's nothing fancy about this at all. There's no AI. It's not even that cool, but it's really important. And that is because every participant will get to vote on every single statement in a good old-fashioned vote. When we do this, we actually gather 2 types of votes. The first is an absolute vote. This basically means here's the statement by itself. Do you agree with it or not? But the second, because if we're successful, we hope that most people will actually agree with most of these, is we then have people rank statements. And this is to get us a little higher resolution picture of, even if everyone basically agrees on everything, are there differences in priorities that we can come to understand out of it? And if all of it works, the output of this process is going to be a set of results. It's going to be a list of all the statements that went into it and a set of numbers that quantify how well each of these statements represent kind of all of the sides involved and all of the participants overall. And if we're successful, we will hopefully find that they are highly representative or have high agreement across all sides of the groups that are participating. So that's the process to go from the collective dialogue and its outputs to find likely common ground, to distill that likely common ground, have an expert review it to make sure nothing went awry, and then validate it back with the original participants to make sure that it is indeed representative. And if it's not, to understand that coming out of the results. Now, that's kind of one process. The last thing I'll note is, while we often will do a variant of this process in different contexts, in this case, it was important that there wasn't biases that would get introduced along the way. And so at a few key junctures, there was folks from either side that would review kind of the pieces that went into this. So review the dialogue prompts, the questions that were going to be asked or prompt to participants, that would review the distilled statements before they went on to final testing, and would review the results to make sure there was no shenanigans in how those results were ultimately tabulated and then communicated. Now, so that is the process to get us to common ground, but we're still not yet at something that is iterative. But the step here is pretty simple. So we take all of this process to find common ground, we'll put that in a big blue box and distill it down and say our common ground process starts with dialogue prompts, involves 2 engagements with participants, and outputs the set of results that we hope are going to paint a picture of where there is common ground. Then what we add to this is a step of deliberation. And this is basically folks from ALMEP and ALMEP adjacent from both sides making sense of what these results mean and what the takeaways are from those. And this deliberation then feeds into 2 things. The first is it feeds into the next set of dialogue prompts. So while there's going to be thematic similarities from dialogue to dialogue, there will be learnings from one that might inform the other. And the second is that they'll decide what to choose and how to communicate it to the participants. So the participants are sort of brought along in these cadence of dialogues with the learnings as those learnings build up. So that is kind of the process. So from one dialogue cycle to the next. In this case, we didn't start by going straight with everyone together. Instead, the decision was to start uninationally, to start with just Israeli Jews and run a dialogue with them, and then run a dialogue with Palestinians in occupied territories, Palestinian citizens of Israel. And then if all of that went well, and we could indeed find some common ground and understand the contours of where productive dialogue could take place, then we would move on to the joint dialogue. But I'll note there's kind of a key thing that needs solved before we could actually go into this. And that is that most of these are not going to take place in English. Actually, it's important that they take place in the local dialects of the people who are participating. And so the challenge here is that when we originally developed this, we knew that it worked really, really good in English. And so what we had to do is redevelop this LLM pipeline to process all of the results in a way that would stay true to the original language of the participants. And so what we did here was had to figure out what are these prompts and examples that are going to go in. The short version of it is we basically just tried everything. So we kind of went through every permutation of constructing these that we could, including all the prompts and examples being written by native speakers of these different languages. That meant that we could take Hebrew inputs and get Hebrew outputs. We could take Palestinian Arabic inputs and get Palestinian Arabic outputs. And what we did was basically covered up what was in between, recruited some of our friends who are Palestinians and Israelis to then review these results and decide what of these best represent or stay true to the original language that was coming into them. The punchline here is it turns out that the best results came from having all of the prompts and examples in the LLM pipeline actually being in native language. To some, this was obvious and not surprising. To some ML engineers, this was incredibly surprising and spurred all kinds of different research. But being pragmatic for the sake of this just told us these are now the pipelines that we're going to use to analyze these different types of language inputs. And so that set us up for being able to run each uninational dialogue in the native language. But if we wanted to be able to run the joint dialogue, that meant that we were going to actually have to run the whole thing simultaneously in 3 different languages. So if we look across this process, there's basically 5 different places where we need things to exist in at least 3 languages, in Palestinian Arabic, in Hebrew, and in English, because some participants expressed desire to participate in English. And so the dialogue prompts, they needed to be in all 3 languages. The actual participant statements needed to be in all 3 languages, and they needed translated live on the fly as people participated. The distilled statements needed to come out in all 3 languages. The final set of statements to vote on needed to be in all 3 languages, and the results and the naming of the metrics actually had to be in all 3 languages as well. Luckily, if 5 years ago, this would have been a near impossible task. Today, this task was actually fairly doable. Thanks to kind of modern AI. So for dialogue prompts, we started with Google Translate and then had native speakers review all of the final prompts before they actually went out. So that Google Translate gets you maybe 90% of the way there. The last 10% was done by humans. For the live dialogue, we used Google Translate. And I'll note here, it was not perfect. And we didn't go into it assuming it would be perfect. And actually, we communicated to participants, hey, we are using Google Translate for this. It's going to be imperfect. And if you see something that looks funky or imperfect, that is why, and you should know. But it was good enough that we could actually support this all in real time. Then for distilled statements, we were able to use the LLM, worked quite well. The final statements to vote on, again, the final layer of humans reviewing everything so that these final statements were really good. The translations were really tight across all of the languages. And then for the final set of results, we combined Google Translate to kind of do quick translations of the metrics and then have native speakers just give it a look over and tweak things that were incorrect. So that let us then actually run this whole thing, not just in one language, but in 3 languages simultaneously so that the maximum amount of people could participate and everyone could participate in their native language. So that's set up for running these sets of dialogues. First, the uninational or separate dialogues that were each in individual native languages, and then the joint dialogue where we brought everybody together and enabled them to participate in their native language. So I'm going to pass it here over to Natali then to talk through what the focus was of these and what results came out of them.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so I'll start by saying that you can imagine how much data we got out of each and every cycle here. And of course, we don't have the time to cover this, so I will just give a small sample of some of these findings. And I'll start with the uninational session. So again, these conversations that were in 3 separated cycles, one with only Jewish Israelis, the other one with Palestinians from occupied territories, and then the Palestinians from Israeli citizens. So we asked a lot of questions and we had different points of focus, but the 3 kind of overarching themes across these dialogues and the things we really wanted to know were what are the values that they think are most important for residents of the region to share, what vision do they have for the future of the region, and the red lines. And I'll give now a few examples, again, a few examples only from each of these themes, just to give you a sense of what it means to have actually outcomes and like results from all of this incredible process that Andrew shared with us. And I'll start actually with the red lines. And I'll just start by explaining what we mean by that or what we were looking to find here. And here what we really wanted to assess is what actions or statements the participants will not tolerate that the other side or their own side will say or do. And that means that basically we were looking for 2 things. So one, we wanted to know what the other group can say that you will say, okay, I'm done. I'm done with this conversation. You crossed a line. I'm disengaging. I'm out. And these are the red lines for out group. And then the other thing we wanted to know, what are the things that your own identity group can say that you will hold them accountable and you will say, this is not acceptable. I will not tolerate you saying anything like this about the other group. And these are the red lines for in-group. Yeah, so these are the 2 things that we really wanted to know. And in most broad terms, we did see after analyzing the data that across all the groups, there was intolerance of any violence of any kind, whether the violence was inflicted by the other side or by one's own side. And here we want to give you something a little bit more explicit and more particular. So here we see examples of some of the statements produced by the participants. And what is interesting here is that we see that some of the red lines the Jewish Israelis pose for their own group, again, the in-group, what they will not tolerate from their own folks saying or doing regarding the other side, actually corresponded to and respected the red lines that the Palestinians set for the out group. Again, as a reminder, things they said, if the other group, if the Jewish Israelis will say or stand behind these statements, we are out, we're disengaging. So for example, look at those that are in red boxes. Israeli Jews said that talk about deporting Palestinians is crossing a red line. And that really corresponds and respects the red line set by the Palestinians for out group, where they said, we will be out if someone is supporting call for forced displacement. Another example you can see here in the blue box, Israeli Jews said that depriving Palestinians of human rights is a crossing of a red line. And that really corresponds to what Palestinians posed as a red line for out group, abolishing the existence of the other and not recognizing the rights of the Palestinians. So these are just few examples where you can see how the red lines are corresponding. And in the next slide, you will see that we found similar dynamics for red lines that the Palestinians pose for their own fellow Palestinians with the red lines that Israeli Jews pose for the out group. Look at the green boxes. The Palestinians said that refusing to recognize the Israeli side is a clear red line. And that corresponds to the red line posed by Jewish Israelis, where they said that calling for destruction of Israel is crossing a red line. And another example is what you can see here in the red boxes. Palestinians said that supporting or justifying violence would be a clear red line, and that corresponds to two of the boxes you can see on the left side posed by the Jewish Israelis, where they said that harming Israeli citizens or justifying the attack on October 7 is crossing a red line. So these are just an examples of red lines and clear messages that both sides will not tolerate from the other side as well as from their own group. And that was, of course, very reassuring as we're moving forward. And it was really impactful when we did share these responses and these results with the participants and our other members from different organizations in Palestine and Israel. This was one of the results that was really important for others to hear and was very impactful in hearing it out loud. So moving forward, the other piece, as I said, that we wanted to know was what are the values that they think are most important for the residents of the region to share and to hold. And again, these were 3 separated cycles. So each cycle produced their own kind of statements and processes. But after analyzing the data, what we saw that across all the 3 cycles, or all the 3 groups, there were 3 themes that resonated. And one was peace, the second was equality, and the third was human life. And again, each might have articulated it slightly different, but it goes down to either of these 3 themes. And just as an example, you can see that the Jewish Israelis wrote to this question of what important value to hold: the value of peace, recognition of the right of all people to live in peace, security and without violence. The Palestinians from occupied territories said promoting peace, and Palestinians and citizens of Israel said recognizing the right to coexistence and peace among different groups and cultures. So this is an example of a value that went across all groups, slightly different articulation, of course, and got a really high agreement score among everyone, right? We see that the lowest agreement score was 90% of the Palestinian citizens of Israel still believe that this is a really important value to hold. And same goes for equality and human life. To save us time, I will not read through them, but you can see that these themes came across the groups, slightly different wording, but really high agreement scores. The lowest agreement score that you see on this screen is 85%, which I think we can all agree is quite high, especially during such sensitive time on such sensitive topic. So I think we can move forward to the third team. And as with values, what we really wanted to hear from the participant is their vision of future, how the future might look like, how they want it to look like in the region. And again, across 3 cycles or 3 dialogues, we saw themes that resonating, and the 3 that were really highly shared by all groups were independence, safety, and prosperity. And we can look, for example, at the safety theme. Israeli Jews wrote statements along this line: free and safe movement for everyone in the entire space, with 91% of Israeli Jews participants agreeing that this is an important value to share, important vision for the region. Palestinians from occupied territories articulated as equality and rights and duty and sense of security, with 92% agreement on this vision. And the Palestinian citizens of Israel said it straight away as safe and equal society, with 100% agreement. So same dynamic for all the 3 themes. The lowest agreement score at 89% here. Again, what we see in both the value question and the vision question is that there is a common ground, and we can distill shared vision, shared values among these populations on this in this time and on these critical topics. So that was just a really small example of some of the data, some of the results that we got from the uninational sessions. And now I will give a small sample from a result from our joint session. Before that, I'll just say I don't think we can underestimate what that means to hold a cross-border conversation during this time. So just because I'm not sure that we shared it already, but we did all of these conversations from April to July. So we're talking in the midst of all of this, high emotions, a lot of trauma, and having this conversation physically would be just impossible. So again, the tool allows to have this conversation to start with. And again, with the ability to do it in 3 different languages simultaneously. It was one of the first attempt to even try something like this cross-border on such scale. So I just wanted to start with this. But that, of course, puts a lot of pressure. What is it that we're going to focus on, right, in such setting? And we asked a bunch of questions, some of them kind of repeated themes that we already discussed in the new national setting, like the questions on values and shared vision, because we really wanted to see what it means to have this conversation in a setting where you're sitting with people, although it's online, but still you are conversing with people from the other side. How does that going to impact the responses? But they also ask other questions more specifically about partnership between civil society peace builders, Israelis and Palestinians, about principles behind an ideal partnership, as well as different strategies. And I'll just note, in this presentation, we are really focusing on the common ground, and I'm sharing with you the results that really highlight the foundations for common ground. But it's important to know that, of course, there were also points of divergence and points where not all of the participants agree one with another. And I'm happy to speak more to it in the Q&A portion. But just like short example, there was a disagreement about best strategies of messaging, whether we should do a messaging as peace builders that is really clear, really sharp, might be a little bit controversial, might disengage some audiences, versus having messaging that maybe is a little bit more ambiguous, but more inclusive, and therefore will allow us to be more expansive with our audiences. But the idea is here really to show you the possibility that this tool holds for finding this common ground upon which we can build better dialogue and strategies for advocacy and other efforts. So what I will share with you here are 2 really concrete letters that we were able to produce through this exercise. Because what we wanted to know is what they, the peace builders in the region, would like to say, if they can, to the world leaders, as well as to the residents of the region. And the idea is to see whether they can join in messaging to these 2 communities, the world leaders and the residents. Because if we do have a joint message, it would be really important in our endeavor to de-escalate, in our endeavor to move toward conflict resolution. So we asked them, if you could, what statements would you want to include in these letters? And I will show you now the letters, the statements and the letters. But before that, I'll just do a side note, and I'm sure that Andrew would love to talk more about it in the Q&A. And that's that we understood really well that due to the difference in sample sizing between the communities, that we might have a problem of imbalanced responses to these type of questions. So we took it really seriously and we thought really hard into it. And we used an equal power matrix that would correct this issue. And again, Andrew will talk us through this process in the Q&A, but I just wanted to put it out there so when you read through these statements, you know that we had this process at the backstage. And what you see now in this next slide are 5 statements. So just to recall the process that Andrew walked us through, in the live conversation, folks gave a bunch of different statements, different things that they would like to be included in a letter toward leaders. And then we distilled it to 5 statements after all the checks that Andrew explained with humans and AI, right? And we have these 5 statements that we put in a poll. Again, nothing fancy, no AI in the poll. We just really wanted to see how people respond to that. Do they still agree that these things should be included? And then how would they rank them from 1 to 5, where 1 is the most important or most urgent thing to include? And what you can see here are the 5 demands from the world leaders. The first would be an immediate ceasefire and release of all hostages. And that was actually ranked first by all the participants from all the 3 identity groups. The second one was recognize both sides' trauma. The third, create an international fund to build the foundations for a comprehensive long-term solution. The fourth, include civil society and NGOs in peace-building discussions. And the last but not least, create a globalized coalition to assist Gaza's reconstruction. And you can also see the agreements, the bridging agreement, and the lowest here is 90% agreement. So again, all of these demands were agreed upon with our participants. All of them were critical and important. So I don't want no one coming out of that being like, oh, coalition to Gaza's reconstruction is not important. But we wanted to confront the participant with a choice. So they actually had to rank these. And that's what you see here. And in the next slide, you see an example of AI-generated letter that we as OLMEP, and Wasim said it earlier, one of the things that we do is advocating for increasing awareness of the work of the civil society peacebuilding communities in the region and increasing the funds that go toward this important work. So we were able to use some of this language and some of these demands in the advocacy efforts that we're doing with government officials from the EU, from European countries, from the US. And again, it was generated by the community. So it has a different type of legitimacy than if we as OLMEP, we were like, these are our demands, right? These are the demands of the peacebuilding community. And now in the next slide, you see a similar process. Again, we asked question, the question was, what kind of statements, what kind of things you would like to include in a letter to all the residents of the region? Same process happened. Folks generated a bunch of statements. We distilled into 5 demands that we would include in such a letter and asked them to vote whether they think it's an important thing to include, if they agree with this inclusion. And we asked them to rank from 1 to 5, with again 1 being the most urgent thing, most important thing to include. As you can see here, the first demand was we all must condemn violence and promote human dignity. The second, we must all demand the end of occupation and settlement expansion. Third, we must pressure governments to end hostilities and negotiate peace. Fourth, we all must recognize the right of self-determination for both people. And lastly, we must create a regional coalition against violence and extremism. As you can see here again, the lowest agreement rate was 85%. With the second point, we must all demand the end of occupation, settlement, expansion. But this statement was actually, unsurprisingly, the very first rated by the Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinians from occupied territories, whereas the first statement, we all must condemn violence, was ranked first by the Israeli Jews. And this is not surprising given the context and the asymmetrical power relationship of this conflict that also aligns with everything we know from the literature of asymmetrical power relations in conflict. So this is that. Again, small sample of some of the results, but before kind of concluding this presentation and talking a little bit about our future plans, I want to say that, you know, and I really, I think, Andrew, you said in one of our meetings that we really need to be cognizant that using tools like Remesh for this sort of exercises is not just research, and maybe not even primarily research. I'm now presenting you these findings, but what it actually is an experience through which the participants are going through, and, you know, they're leaving these experiences maybe with slight different responses, like different attitudes. So we really need to be cognizant about it when we're designing it, when we're reflecting on it, and of course, when we are treating these results and thinking about future steps with them. And luckily, or fortunately, we saw a very positive feedback from the participants of this cycle, from the Peace Builder community, with folks saying that it gave them hope, that it was an incredible experience for them, that they could share openly without fear of being judged due to, of course, this like high level anonymity. It was a lot of self-reflection for their own motivations. And I will actually read the full last quote from one of the participants, because I think it really kind of highlights a lot of the advantages of this tool and what it allows to do and what kind of experience it allows. So, quote, "I know there is an end goal for this, but seeing each other's anonymous thoughts in this way is valuable in and of itself. And perhaps this sort of work could be integrated in various ways as part of more regular activities. The openness of anonymity is important," end quote. And we already see that other organizations are thinking to use this tool in their own working. I know that when I'm speaking with folks from different NGOs and other entities, they're really trying to think how this can help them in their own processes within their own communities. So I really wanted to end like the findings section with this, to always keep in mind where we're thinking about using such tools in of course, in this environment. But to conclude, the first phase that focused on the Peacebuilding community really proved us, this process works, and we as OMAP were able to execute it, especially, and that was really reassuring thinking forward about our next step. We were able to find a common ground among the Peacebuilder community, and it really helped us to find some points of divergence that, again, although I didn't present it today, they were really important to share with our members and our NGOs and start a serious process of thinking what these points of divergence mean for each and everyone's work and for us as partner that supports them in their work. But now thinking about the next phase, I'll be very honest, we are in very initial stages of the design of second phase. There are a lot of questions and considerations and a lot of challenges that we need to address before we can actually start executing the second phase. But two things are clear to us. This second stage will be with the broad populations, the wider Israel and Palestinian populations. We really want to give both societies an independent collective voice. And we do want to find a strategic common ground among these populations, right? These goals are clear to us. Now the question is, how do we actually do that? And as I said, there are a lot of challenges. I just speak briefly to two, and then I'll pass it to Andrew. One is, of course, the access question. How do we access the voice of Palestinians? And this is a serious difficulty that we need to tackle, especially if we want a representative sample. And then the second goes back kind of the point of experience. If it is an experience, there is also the risk that it's not going to be that positive experience and that it can actually bring harm to some of the participants. So how do we tackle that? How do we ensure in our design that we at least mitigate as much as possible this risk? And one of our thoughts is to start with uninational work. So as we did with the Peacebuilders community, not jumping immediately to wider conversations across the border, but actually do a deep dive within each of these communities. And that should mitigate both the risk of harm. And then it also will have the accessibility issue, because we can maybe start smaller, start with university students to whom we have easier access, do it on more like small stage, see things, how they work, tweak things along the process, and then expand it to the broader national level with the actual representation of both societies. So I'll stop here. I'll pass it to Andrew to conclude us with a few other challenges. Please feel free to add to whatever I said, but also if there are any other challenges that, Andrew, you want to speak to.
Yeah,
Actually,
awesome.
Jump in here, Natali, because a lot of questions have come in, and I'd actually like to ask Wasim to start by answering the questions some of the questions that he's seen there.
Okay, well, I think they're mostly technical question for Andrew, but I'll try to answer the ones from my experience in working on the project. So I think Melissa asked about the time. The sessions took about 30 minutes each. Well, a little longer because to get people inside the same space, and recruitment was a bit of an issue. And there was also a little bit of commitment to do an after session short survey, which we had to do in different times and different days, depending on our members' time. If I remember this correctly, Andrew, you could pitch in.
Yeah, so it was about 30 to 45 minutes on the dialogue part, and then the follow-up survey, kind of that validation voting, was maybe around 15 to 20 minutes. And so each cycle had both of those that would happen. And there was, in some cases where people couldn't all make it live, we would allow asynchronous follow-up. So people could participate in that original dialogue without having to show up for the live one by kind of coming back in, still voting on all the same responses and contributing their own, but doing it kind of in the couple days that would follow the live dialogue.
So that answer another question about the asynchronous process. Yes, it's possible. But I would highly recommend the live one. Victor asked a question about polarized group, which I think it's relevant because in this process itself, this was a group of peace builders, obviously, of some of them known each other for a long time, but we're talking about a very difficult time of the conflict itself. I think like in a polarized context, being able to hold anonymous participation is a great plus. And that's even the case for Palestinians who were engaged on the process themselves, who remained anonymous throughout the process. It was very good that just being able to basically feel safe and better represented throughout the process. We did do a pre-dialogue warm-up, just to explain to the people how the process will look like. We also talked about security concerns because for some of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, it was a concern that their identity is being tracked online, in some cases that happened and reported. We had a feedback mechanism loop where we basically just talked about how the process will look like. People would just talk to us about it, and then we just go back and then we refine the questions and sort of like refine the process itself. You definitely need somebody who understands the language and the culture to be part of the process. We had two people running this on the Palestinian and Israeli side, just being able to be moderators, just to understand and read the room, basically. I hope this answers some of that questions about polarization. And I'm sort of approaching this as somebody who worked as a moderator and facilitator before. And then there was a somewhat close question also from about that the language or some of the terminology used terms are interpreted constantly across dialogues. We did try in every question to define key terms. So we could say like, what do you think about peace, for example? And by peace, we mean 1, 2, 3, 4. And then there was a job of the Palestinian and the Israelis who work on this across the border to basically make sure that translation is accurate. And that was me on the Palestinian side. I hope that answered the questions.
That's great. Thanks so much, Wasim. Andrew, you want to pick up some of the other questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll just kind of quick run through what is in my webinar sidebar chat. So someone asked around ballpark numbers. I think overall we tabulated maybe 420 participants, but that is not unique participants. And so I think there's a lot of overlap in a lot of these. So I think the sessions were in the tens to 100-ish amount of participants in any one of those like dialogues. Second question here. Who is the moderator? So in this case, like all of the prompts that go into it were decided ahead of time. As Wasim alluded to, Wasim was collaborating with an Israeli counterpart. And so all of the prompts they would like co-develop and then we'd get translated and go in there. So I guess there was sort of two effective moderators in that sense, although usually it was Wasim or his Israeli counterpart literally clicking the button live. I think Wasim, you remember you did a few of those and you guys kind of tag team back and forth on that. how much time do participants spend? And I saw someone ask a follow-up on this. So each collective dialogue averaged about 30 to 40 minutes worth of participating time. So, there was 4 of them. So, 4 things, each of which took 30 to 40 minutes. And then the kind of follow-up vote, which is just a survey, again, just a poll, was maybe we estimated around 15 to 20 minutes that people would spend on that. So each cycle was maybe about 45 to 50 minutes of a participant's time. I'll also note just on the kind of the question around working with a more polarized population. Certainly this group was relatively polarized in terms of what the data would show. It doesn't appear here because we focused everything here on finding common ground. I will note we've run variants of this process in other polarized contexts with general populations. And give or take, it works the same. The one kind of challenge that Natali was teeing me up to just mention that we will expect to face here is we call it the bridging concreteness trade-off. This layman version of this is that it is often easy for people to agree on platitudes, but it is trickier to find agreement on actual concrete solutions and useful things. And so we're working with a bunch of very smart folks that are not me, that are working on developing methods to kind of solve for that at scale so that we don't just find and summarize a bunch of platitudes as common ground, but we can, in that sea of platitudes or in that sea of common ground that we'll find at scale, we can pluck out the actual concrete things where there is likely to be common ground. So this is a very weird technical academic challenge, but it turns out to be pragmatically really important because it's the difference between what we found was in America, we have this saying, live, love, laugh, that people put on their boards. So it's the difference between finding live, love, laugh statements versus finding something useful and concrete that you can actually action on and makes a difference. And so it's a technical thing, but a super important one for making this useful. The bridging concreteness trade-off, Xander asked what the term was for.
All right. Adnan Jabri was also part of our class, our workshop here in June. Adnan, can you come on live? Nick, can you allow
Yes.
Adnan?
Let me bring him, promote him to a panelist.
Okay, and while you're doing that, I just want to add a note here that there's a variety of different types of deliberative technology, and Remesh works really well for this type of thing, where you're doing a really demographic sample and you can really get fine-tuned about what different segments of the population think and feel. It is anonymous, so I'm going to come back in a minute, Andrew, to ask you more about the anonymity, but also then the security. So this is not being released live. Sometimes Polis and some of the others are a link and anybody can participate. And this operates in a little bit differently, so it has fewer security risks, I think. So I'll come back to you on that. But Adnan, why don't you join us live and ask questions?
You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Pleasure to meet you all. My name is Adnan Jaber. I'm from Jerusalem, now living in Los Angeles, and I teach at UCLA. I participated in the Remesh survey with the Alliance for Middle East Peace. I really enjoyed the experience myself. I found it very interesting, the way it helps us find our common grounds. And I shared here 3 questions. How do you promise anonymity to the participants? A lot of people are suspicious of new platforms and what data they get from you. So I'm really worried about that when we do the public survey. And the second question is, how are you planning to ensure that in the public survey, people share the real opinions? And the third question, I know that we're having a big problem in accessibility for the Palestinians to use new stuff. And I feel that they're very comfortable with WhatsApp. And I was just wondering if you would consider maybe running the survey using WhatsApp.
Andrew.
Yeah, so on the anonymity side, I'll sort of say the honest answer is that there is no like golden silver bullet. Like we don't do this one thing that ensures everything is perfect. We do a bunch of different things that sort of all pull together to go above and beyond kind of the normal variant of anonymity. So the kind of lowest level version of anonymity is like, if someone were to grab the data and look at it as it transmits, can they do that? And the answer is no. So everything becomes encrypted kind of as it leaves Remesh and makes it to our servers, and even actually when it's stored in our servers. But that's sort of base level stuff. The next is, we make sure that we don't store IP addresses or any other type of data that could like link back. So this is not your individual, this is like metadata, but there's metadata that can actually trace back. So we basically make sure that all of that disappears, or that we don't actually transmit it, and whatever is like technologically feasible. The third then is then statistical anonymity, which is a little more nuanced, but actually really important when you are asking people demographics. If you ask people enough demographic questions, you can actually locate with probabilistic certainty who they are. If I know your age, your location, your education, your background, where you like to eat, like it turns out about 12 questions or 14 questions of the right things you can actually identify. And so we try to practice statistical anonymity, which is to basically limit the resolution and number of demographics that we gather. So even if you could get one person's data point and know that it came from a Palestinian who is 18 years old, who is Muslim, that's not enough to actually narrow down in any way that puts a risk on that person. And so we're careful to kind of draw those lines. And then the last is the way that participants, like the way that we share a link out with participants. We basically generate one thing that goes out to everybody, so that there is no actual identifier attached to who even, like how people joined. So there's kind of tooling, actually in a Zoom link, this often is the case. So when I clicked my Zoom link to come in here, there was an Andrew link, and that Andrew link was specific to me, and that's why like my name shows up here. But in our case, we don't do that either. And so this means that kind of as people enter, they're anonymous, their demographics are anonymous, their personal information isn't being stored, and everything's being encrypted over the wire. I'll note there's no guarantees of perfection, but this basically gets us up to as good of a standard as you would expect from, say, WhatsApp or Signal or these other types of platforms that sort of are, I would say, gold standard for security. I'll note a lot of this we didn't do just specific to this. We've been working with the UN for maybe 4 years or so, and they also have an extremely high bar for this. And so a lot of this has been getting put in place over that period of time. I'll note the answer to your question around getting people to share their real opinions. I actually think it's, at least in part, highly related to the first question, meaning if people do not feel like they're actually anonymous and that what they share is secure, that's a really good way to fail at getting honest opinions. So like step one is that you have to actually be secure, and you have to communicate that to people in a way that they can understand. Because if you are, but they don't believe it, it actually is not useful. So you have to be that secure. You have to help people understand that. And I know Wasim and I actually went back and forth to like how to succinctly communicate some of this technical bits to some of their folks to understand kind of the measures in place. So that's piece one. And then I think piece number two is that there has to be a reason to be honest. So anonymity gives you the like freedom to be honest, but I think you have to give people some motivation for it. And so I think this is something I'll say not as a solved, but as an open question as we go to residents is, how do you give them that reason? Where does it come from? Ideally, it's because their honesty is going to influence the world in a direction that they care about. And so how do you create the connectivity between what they're doing and that being an actual lever or for change or influence that is worth being honest on? That's just two of the pieces, but I think those are like, at least a big chunk comes from those two. And then there's a long tail of all kinds of other stuff. The last bit around WhatsApp, so two things. One is we can actually invite participants through WhatsApp, and it'll actually like render Remesh in the WhatsApp built-in browser thing. So not like a proper WhatsApp app, but a thing that'll like live within it. The other note is that for that survey step, and that survey step is arguably like the most important for legitimacy, that doesn't even need to take place on Remesh. Like we use Remesh because it's like the tool at hand, but if there's any sort of, if there exists a WhatsApp focused survey tool that everybody trusts, then we could actually run that step just on that tool wherever all those people are and where they already trust. And so I would expect, that's like fully within the realm of things that we'll consider as we think about how do we maximize legitimacy and accessibility to everyone on it.
Interesting. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We are almost at the end of our time. I'll have my colleagues read through the comments one more time to see if we didn't answer any of the questions. But I just wanted to make a brief comment here that in the field of conflict transformation, conflict resolution, and peace building, we often think that we have to do dialogue in person so that there can be relationship building. And some of the other deliberative tech platforms, for example, the Stanford deliberative polling, uses this sort of Zoom interface to enable people to see each other. So it's not anonymous at all. And from that theory of change, it's really important to be able to see each other's identities as you share ideas. But what I have really learned from deliberative technology is that there's kind of a time and a place for these different approaches. And I think all three of you mentioned sort of the timing and the place right now in Israel and Palestine. It really helps to have this anonymity, and it allows a discussion of the ideas in a more free way. And I don't really think the literature and the research in conflict resolution has captured this need to have moments of anonymity. So I just wanted to point that out since this is mostly a peace building crowd. I also want to say this is really technical, and we are really, and Andrew is incredibly generous with his time and his money to be able to support this process, but also just helping many other peace building organizations learn this. So we are trying to sort of digest what Andrew and others have been teaching us, writing it down in a handbook so that it can be accessible for more peace building organizations to be able to figure out when and where to use deliberative technologies to support the peace building process. And so watch out for more events like this one, but also opportunities to maybe read drafts of the workbook or the handbook so that you might be able to help learn some of this yourselves. We will be following up with the recording of this event. Some of you have asked for the emails and the PowerPoint. I'm going to ask the panelists afterwards, and we'll send those out if they're comfortable with that. So I won't make them answer that live. Did you see any other final questions from the draft here?
I think that,
Just what?
oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so one thing, just a quick note. Lisa poked at it, but we didn't actually speak to it directly. The idea of in-person stuff. So I would say everything has been virtual thus far, but not because we said only virtual is the most important thing. Sort of it was like what was possible. And on the contrary, we actually, in following up with participants, there was a pretty good interest in like, we should parallel this with some in-person dialogues and discussions. And we've been experimenting with how that might work. But obviously the logistics of that are trickier than online. So I'll note, just to double click on what Lisa's saying, that I think in the ideal case, these things sort of work in symbiosis. That this doesn't replace the face-to-face dialogue or what I think of as like breaking bread together. It is something different and it augments it. And ideally you balance these two things together over time. So we'll see if we can do some variant like that in the future.
Any final thoughts, Natali, Wasim?
Well, thank you for hosting us. Sorry, go ahead, Natali.
No, that was exactly what I wanted to say. So go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us. I think just a bit of final thought about the process itself, because using tools like Remesh is not really about collecting opinions. It's more about creating space where people can feel heard, and that's, at least in my opinion, the biggest takeaway from this experience. And I think the lesson that I personally learned as someone who worked in the sector for the past 15 years is like, while the technology provides the space, it's the people and the human spirit behind it that really drives change. So keep that in mind when building the new technologies or using this technology in the first place.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today, and look for the recording that you can share out with your friends and family. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for having